More interesting videos are coming soon. Your choice is our goal. Comment what videos you want and subscribe quickly.
The world a peasant was born into. Long before modern cities, electricity, or machines, most people in Europe lived a life that was quiet, difficult, and deeply tied to the land. In the medieval world, the majority of the population were peasants. Historians estimate that nearly 90% of people during the Middle Ages worked as peasants, farmers, or laborers on the land. To understand their lives, we must imagine a completely different world from the one we know today. There were no supermarkets, no hospitals, and no schools for most people. Survival depended on the seasons, the weather, and the soil beneath one's feet. Every day revolved around food, work, and the authority of the local lord who owned the land. A peasant was usually born into the same life that their parents lived. Social mobility was almost non-existent. If your father worked the fields of a manor, you would likely do the same for the rest of your life. The medieval countryside was dotted with small villages. These villages often contained only a few dozen wooden houses clustered around a church and surrounded by fields. Dirt roads connected the village to nearby towns, but travel was rare for most peasants. Many people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. At the center of the local system was the manor. The manor was not just a house, it was the economic heart of the surrounding lands. It belonged to a noble or knight who controlled the property and the people who worked it. The lord of the manor held immense power. Peasants farmed his land, paid him taxes in crops or labor, and depended on him for protection during times of war. Most peasants were not slaves, but they were not free either. Many were serfs, meaning they were legally tied to the land. A serf could not simply leave the village and start a new life somewhere else. Permission from the lord was required even for something as simple as marriage outside the manor. Life began early for a peasant child. From a young age, children helped their families with small tasks. They might gather firewood, fetch water from a nearby well, or help care for animals like chickens and pigs. By the time a child reached 10 or 12 years old, they were already expected to contribute real labor to the family. Childhood, as we understand it today, barely existed. The houses peasants lived in were simple and often uncomfortable. Most homes were small wooden huts with walls made from a mixture of mud, straw, and sticks, known as wattle and daub. The roof was usually covered with thatch, which was made from dried straw or reeds. Inside the house there was usually only one room. This single space served as the kitchen, bedroom, and living area for the entire family. In the center of the room was a hearth where a fire burned almost constantly. This fire provided warmth, light, and a place to cook food. However, most homes did not have chimneys. Smoke simply rose toward a hole in the roof, filling the room with a constant haze. The air inside these houses was often thick with smoke and the smell of animals. In many cases, livestock such as goats or chickens shared the same building during cold nights. Furniture was extremely basic. A rough wooden table, a few stools, and perhaps a chest for storing clothes might be the only items inside. Beds were simple piles of straw or hay covered with rough blankets. Families sometimes slept together for warmth during winter. Hygiene was another challenge. Clean water was limited, and bathing was rare. Rivers or wooden tubs might be used occasionally, but for many peasants, washing happened only a few times a year. Disease spread easily in such conditions. Without knowledge of germs or medicine, illnesses could move quickly through villages. Food was always a concern. A peasant family's survival depended on the harvest. If crops failed because of a drought, frost, or pests, hunger could follow. The main food for most peasants was bread. However, this was not the soft white bread many people eat today. It was usually dark, heavy bread made from grains such as rye or barley. Along with bread, peasants often ate thick vegetable soups called pottage. This stew might contain cabbage, onions, beans, or whatever vegetables were available in the garden. Meat was rare for most peasants. Animals like cows and pigs were valuable and often saved for special occasions or sold for money. Sometimes families kept chickens, which provided eggs. Fish might also be eaten if the village was near a river. The church played an enormous role in medieval life. Almost every village had a small church, and religion shaped the daily routines of the people. Church bells marked the passing of time. Peasants attended services regularly and celebrated many religious festivals throughout the year. These festivals were some of the few moments of joy in a peasant's life. They offered a break from work and an opportunity for the community to gather. But despite these brief moments of celebration, life remained hard. The medieval world was unpredictable. War, famine, disease, and harsh winters could change everything in an instant. For the peasant, survival required constant work and resilience. And every morning, as the sun slowly rose over the fields, another long day of labor would begin. A peasant's daily routine from sunrise to night. For a medieval peasant, the day did not begin with an alarm clock or the sound of traffic outside a window. Instead, life followed the rhythm of nature. The rising and setting of the sun determined almost everything about a peasant's schedule. Most peasants woke up before sunrise. In the quiet darkness of early morning, the small hut would slowly come to life. The fire in the hearth, which had burned through the night, might be stirred back to life to warm the room and prepare the first meal of the day. Breakfast was simple. It often consisted of coarse bread, perhaps dipped into a thin soup or leftover pottage from the night before. Sometimes there might be cheese, onions, or a little ale. Water was not always safe to drink, so weak ale or small beer was commonly consumed even in the morning. After eating, the entire household prepared for work. The fields were the center of a peasant's life. Farming was not just a job, it was survival. Every season required different tasks, and every family member had responsibilities. Men usually performed the heaviest labor. They plowed the fields using wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses. This was extremely hard work. The soil could be heavy and difficult to turn, and the plowmen often walked behind the plow for hours each day. Women also worked constantly. They helped plant seeds, weed crops, and harvest grain. In addition, they had many responsibilities inside the household. Cooking, cleaning, spinning wool into thread, and caring for children all fell largely to women. Children worked alongside their parents. A young boy might help guide animals or scare birds away from newly planted seeds. Girls might help gather vegetables, fetch water, or assist with preparing food. No one in a peasant family was idle. Even the elderly contributed by watching small children, repairing tools, or helping with light tasks. During the spring months, peasants prepared the fields and planted crops. Seeds of barley, wheat, oats, and rye were carefully scattered across the land. The success of these crops would determine whether the family had enough food for the coming year. Summer brought long days under the sun. Weeding fields and maintaining crops required constant attention. If weeds were not removed, they could steal nutrients from the soil and weaken the harvest. Harvest season in late summer and early autumn was the most important and exhausting time of the year. Entire villages worked together to cut and gather the grain before bad weather arrived. Using simple tools such as sickles and scythes, peasants cut the tall stalks of wheat and barley. This work was urgent. If rain came before the grain was safely collected, the harvest could be ruined. During harvest time, peasants often worked from sunrise until sunset without much rest. Every able-bodied person joined the effort. The grain was then tied into bundles and carried to storage areas where it could later be ground into flour. After working in the fields for many hours, peasants returned home in the evening. The evening meal was similar to breakfast and lunch. Pottage remained the most common food. Into this large pot went whatever ingredients were available: vegetables, grains, herbs, and occasionally small pieces of meat. This pot often stayed over the fire for days, with new ingredients constantly added. After dinner, the small house might briefly feel peaceful. Families talked, repaired tools, or worked on small crafts like weaving baskets or spinning wool. However, light was limited. Without electricity, the only light came from the hearth or small candles, which were expensive. Because of this, most peasants went to sleep not long after dark. Sleep itself was not always comfortable. Straw beds were rough, and insects were common. Fleas and lice lived easily in clothing and bedding. Winters could be especially harsh. Cold winds sometimes slipped through the walls of poorly built huts. Families often slept close together for warmth. Yet, even in difficult conditions, sleep was important. Another demanding day would begin at sunrise. This daily routine repeated itself almost every day of the year. The tasks might change with the seasons, but the pattern remained the same. Wake early, work the land, eat simple food, and rest before starting again. For medieval peasants, life was not measured in weekends or vacations. There were no holidays in the modern sense. Only religious festivals and special church days offered brief moments of rest. But even these breaks were short. The land always needed attention, and survival never waited long. And so, as the sun set and darkness returned to the quiet village, the peasants prepared themselves to arise again with the dawn.
The brutal work of farming in the Middle Ages. For medieval peasants, farming was not simply a way to earn food. It was the center of life itself. Every season, every day, and often every hour was shaped by the demands of the land. Farming required strength, patience, and endurance. The work was relentless, and even a small mistake could mean hunger later in the year. Unlike modern farmers who use machines and advanced tools, medieval peasants relied on very simple equipment. Most of their tools were made of wood and iron, and they had to be used entirely by human or animal power. One of the most important tools was the plow. Medieval plows were heavy wooden structures with an iron blade that cut into the soil. Pulling the plow required powerful animals, usually oxen. Oxen were preferred because they were strong and steady, though they moved slowly. Guiding a plow across a field was exhausting work. The farmer walked behind the plow while controlling the animals and making sure the blade cut properly into the earth. The ground was often uneven and filled with rocks or roots, making the task even more difficult. Plowing had to be done carefully. If the soil was not turned properly, seeds would not grow well. Every furrow in the field mattered. After plowing came the planting. Seeds were scattered by hand in a process called broadcasting. A farmer would walk across the field, throwing handfuls of grain into the air and hoping they would fall evenly across the soil. This method was not perfect. Some seeds landed too close together, while others fell on poor ground. Birds also quickly gathered to eat many of the seeds before they could grow. Because of this, children were often sent into the fields to scare birds away. They waved sticks, shouted, or threw small stones to protect the planted grain. Once the crops began to grow, the work continued. Weeds had to be pulled from the soil. These unwanted plants competed with the crops for water and nutrients. Weeding was slow and tiring work. Peasants bent over for hours under the sun, pulling weeds one by one. Another constant concern was the weather. Medieval farmers had very little control over nature. A long drought could dry the soil and kill crops. Too much rain could flood fields and rot plants before they matured. Early frost could destroy an entire harvest overnight. Without modern weather forecasts, peasants had no warning. They could only watch the sky and hope for the best. Summer months were often the most physically demanding. Crops needed constant care, and the heat made work even harder. The sun beat down on the fields, while farmers labored from morning until evening. Clothing offered little protection. Most peasants wore simple wool or linen garments that were rough and heavy. These clothes absorbed sweat and dirt easily. Footwear was basic as well. Many peasants wore simple leather shoes or sometimes worked barefoot in the fields. Despite the hardship of planting and maintaining crops, the most intense time of the year was the harvest. Harvest season determined whether the village would have enough food for the coming winter. When the grain was ready, every able-bodied person joined the effort. Men, women, and children all worked together in the fields. The main tool used during harvest was the sickle. This curved blade allowed workers to cut stalks of grain close to the ground. Using a sickle required skill and careful movements. Workers grasped a bundle of stalks with one hand and cut them with the blade in the other. The work continued hour after hour. Cut stalks were tied into bundles called sheaves. These bundles were then carried and stacked in rows across the field. Later, the grain had to be separated from the stalks in a process called threshing. Peasants beat the bundles with wooden flails to loosen the grain. This produced clouds of dust and chaff that filled the air. After threshing, the grain needed to be cleaned. Workers tossed it into the air so the wind could blow away the lighter husks while the heavier grain fell back down. Every step required physical effort. Even after a successful harvest, peasants did not keep all the grain they produced. A portion had to be given to the lord of the manor as rent or tax. Another portion went to the church as a tithe, usually about 10% of the harvest. What remained had to feed the family for an entire year. This meant careful planning. If too much grain was eaten early in the winter, the family might face hunger in the spring before the next harvest. Because farming tools were simple and harvests were uncertain, medieval peasants constantly lived with the fear of famine. One bad harvest could cause shortages across an entire region. 2 or 3 bad harvests in a row could lead to starvation. Despite all this hardship, peasants continued their work year after year. Farming was not a choice, but a necessity. The land demanded their labor, and survival depended on their ability to endure the endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. As the fields slowly emptied after harvest and autumn winds began to blow across the countryside, peasants prepared for the next challenge that every year would bring: winter. And winter in the medieval world could be one of the harshest tests of all.
Hunger, famine, and the constant fear of starvation. For medieval peasants, hunger was never far away. Even in good years, when the harvest was successful, food supplies were often limited. Families had to carefully manage what they had, knowing that the next harvest was many months away. If anything went wrong with the crops, the results could be devastating. Unlike modern societies where food can be transported from distant places, medieval villages depended almost entirely on their own local harvests. If the crops in that area failed, there was rarely another source of food. One of the most dangerous times of the year was late winter and early spring. By this point, the food stored after the harvest had been eaten for many months. Grain supplies were running low, vegetables had long since been consumed, and animals were often too valuable to slaughter. This difficult period was sometimes called the hungry months. During these weeks, families stretched their remaining food as far as possible. Bread was made thinner, soups contained more water, and meals became smaller. Pottage, the common peasant stew, became even simpler. Instead of thick mixtures filled with vegetables and grains, it might contain little more than herbs, roots, and a few scraps of grain. Peasants sometimes turned to wild foods during times of shortage. They gathered berries, nuts, mushrooms, and edible plants from forests or fields. However, this food was unpredictable and often not enough to feed an entire village. In desperate situations, people even ate foods that normally would not be considered meals. Tree bark, boiled grass, or ground acorns were sometimes used as substitutes when grain was gone. Livestock were valuable assets, and killing them during food shortages was usually avoided. A cow could provide milk for years. Chickens produced eggs. A pig could be raised and eventually slaughtered when absolutely necessary. Because animals were so important, many peasants tried to keep them alive through the winter, even when feeding them was difficult. Weather played a powerful role in determining whether a harvest would succeed or fail. Heavy rains could destroy crops by flooding fields. Long droughts dried the soil and prevented seeds from growing. One of the greatest dangers was an early frost. If freezing temperatures arrived before crops were fully harvested, entire fields of grain could be ruined overnight. When crops failed on a large scale, famine could spread across entire regions. Famine was not simply a shortage of food. It was a slow and terrifying process. People weakened from hunger became vulnerable to disease. Malnutrition made it harder for the body to fight infections. Villages suffering from famine often faced outbreaks of illness at the same time. Parents struggled to feed their children. Communities tried to share what little food remained, but sometimes there simply was not enough for everyone. During severe famines, people were forced to make heartbreaking decisions. Families might leave their villages in search of food in distant towns. Others begged at monasteries or churches, where charity was sometimes offered. But even the church could only help so much. When famine affected an entire region, food became scarce everywhere. One of the most famous famines in medieval Europe occurred during the early 14th century. Heavy rains ruined harvests for several years in a row, leading to widespread hunger across much of the continent. Crops failed repeatedly, livestock died from disease, and food prices rose dramatically. Ordinary peasants could not afford the little food that was available. Many people starved during those terrible years. The fear of famine shaped the way peasants thought about food and survival. Every grain of wheat mattered. Nothing was wasted. Leftover bread might be dried and saved for later use. Vegetable scraps were added to soups. Bones from animals were boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of nutrition possible. Storage was also important. Grain was kept in barns or storage pits, carefully protected from moisture and pests. Rats and mice could destroy valuable supplies if they reached the stored grain. Because food was so precious, stealing it was considered a serious crime. Someone caught stealing grain or livestock could face harsh punishment from the lord of the manor. Despite all these dangers, peasants continued to rely on the land year after year. They planted seeds with hope, knowing that nature would ultimately decide their fate. Good harvests brought relief and temporary comfort. Poor harvests brought fear and hardship. For the medieval peasant, survival was never guaranteed. Hunger was a constant shadow that followed them through every season. And while famine threatened their bodies, another danger lurked silently within their villages: disease. In a world without modern medicine or understanding of germs, illness could spread quickly and claim many lives. In the next chapter, we will explore the frightening reality of sickness and death in the medieval countryside.
Disease, plague, and the fragile life of a peasant. In the medieval world, sickness was a constant and frightening presence. For peasants living in small villages and crowded homes, disease could spread quickly and with little warning. Without modern medicine, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of how illnesses spread, people had very few ways to protect themselves. A simple infection that might be easily treated today could become deadly in the Middle Ages. Most villages had no doctors. Medical knowledge was limited and often mixed with superstition and religious beliefs. When someone became sick, families relied on herbal remedies, prayers, and traditional treatments passed down through generations. Women in the village often served as informal healers. They gathered plants and herbs from forests or fields and used them to treat wounds and illnesses. Herbs such as mint, sage, and garlic were believed to have healing properties. Some remedies helped a little, but many illnesses were simply too powerful for the treatments available at the time. Living conditions made disease more likely. Peasant homes were small and poorly ventilated. Smoke from the hearth filled the room, and animals often shared the same space with people during cold nights. Clean water was not always easy to find. Wells could become contaminated, and rivers sometimes carried waste from nearby villages. Because people did not understand bacteria or viruses, they had no idea that invisible organisms were causing many of their illnesses. Common diseases included fevers, infections, and stomach illnesses. Cuts and injuries were particularly dangerous. A small wound could become infected, leading to swelling, fever, and sometimes death. Dental health was another problem. Without proper care or treatment, tooth infections could spread through the body. Childbirth was also extremely dangerous. Many women died while giving birth, and infant mortality was very high. It was common for families to lose children at a young age. Life expectancy in the medieval period was much shorter than it is today. While some people lived into their 50s or 60s, many died much younger. But the most terrifying disease of the Middle Ages was the plague. In the mid-14th century, a devastating outbreak known as the Black Death spread across Europe. The disease arrived through trade routes, traveling with merchants, ships, and goods from distant lands. The plague moved quickly from town to town and village to village. For peasants, the arrival of the plague was terrifying. People who seemed healthy one day could become violently ill the next. Fever, weakness, and painful swellings appeared on the body. Villages sometimes lost large portions of their population within weeks. Families watched helplessly as neighbors, friends, and loved ones fell sick. Fear spread just as quickly as the disease itself. Many people believed the plague was a punishment from God. Others blamed bad air or mysterious forces they could not understand. Because no one knew how the disease spread, attempts to stop it were mostly ineffective. In some places, entire villages were abandoned. People fled in the hope of escaping the illness, often carrying the disease with them to new areas. Burials became a constant part of life. Churches struggled to keep up with the number of deaths, and mass graves were sometimes used when there was no time to bury individuals properly. The Black Death killed millions of people across Europe. In some regions, nearly half of the population died. For the peasants who survived, life changed in unexpected ways. With so many workers gone, labor became more valuable. Some peasants were able to demand better conditions or slightly higher wages for their work. But even after the worst of the plague had passed, disease remained a serious threat. Other illnesses continued to appear, and medical knowledge improved only slowly over time. Despite these dangers, peasants continued their lives. They planted crops, raised families, and rebuilt villages after waves of illness had passed. Death was a familiar part of life in the medieval world. People saw it often, and it shaped their beliefs and traditions. Religion offered comfort during these difficult times. Many peasants believed that suffering on earth would be rewarded in the afterlife. And so, even in a world filled with sickness and uncertainty, they carried on. But disease and hunger were not the only hardships peasants faced. Another powerful force controlled their lives: the system of lords, land, and obligation, known as feudalism.
The feudal system and the power of the lord. To truly understand the life of a medieval peasant, it is necessary to understand the system that controlled almost every part of their existence. This system was known as feudalism. It shaped the structure of medieval society and determined where a person stood in the social order. At the top of this system was the king. The king ruled the land, but in reality his power depended heavily on powerful nobles who controlled large territories. These nobles were called lords, and they owned vast areas of farmland known as manors. The manor was the center of rural life. Each manor included fields, forests, pastures, a village, and the large house where the lord or his representative lived. Surrounding this central estate were the small homes of peasants who worked the land. Peasants depended on the manor for survival, but the manor also depended on their labor. Under the feudal system, peasants worked the land owned by the lord in exchange for protection and the right to live there. In a world where wars, raids, and bandit attacks were common, protection was considered extremely valuable. But this arrangement came with many obligations. Most peasants were serfs, which meant they were legally tied to the land they worked. A serf was not exactly a slave, but they were not free either. They could not simply leave the manor whenever they wished. If a serf wanted to move to another village, they needed the lord's permission. Often that permission was never granted. Serfs also had to give a portion of their labor to the lord. Several days each week were spent working the lord's personal fields rather than their own small plots of land. These work days were called labor dues. During these days, peasants planted, harvested, repaired fences, cut wood, or completed whatever tasks the lord required. Only after these duties were finished could they return to work on the fields that produced food for their own families. In addition to labor, peasants paid various forms of taxes. A portion of their crops went to the lord as rent. Another portion went to the church as a tithe. This tithe was usually about 10% of their harvest. Peasants also had to pay fees for many everyday activities. If they wanted to grind their grain into flour, they often had to use the lord's mill and pay for the service. If they baked bread in the lord's oven or pressed grapes in the lord's wine press, they paid additional fees. Even marriage could require payment. If a serf wished to marry someone from another manor, a special fee was often demanded by the lord. These many obligations meant that peasants kept only a portion of what they produced. Despite all this, most peasants accepted the system because it was the only world they knew. Feudalism had existed for generations, and questioning it was rare. The lord of the manor held enormous authority over the village. He controlled the land, settled disputes between villagers, and enforced rules. In many cases, the lord or his appointed officials held local courts where disagreements were judged. Punishments for breaking rules could be severe. Stealing food, damaging property, or failing to perform required labor could result in fines, public punishment, or even imprisonment. However, the Lord also had responsibilities. In return for the peasants' labor and taxes, the Lord was expected to provide protection. If enemies attacked or raiders threatened the area, the Lord's soldiers defended the manor. Many manors included a fortified building or small castle where people could seek shelter during dangerous times. The Lord was also responsible for maintaining order and ensuring the land remained productive. Although the relationship between Lord and peasant was unequal, both sides depended on each other in different ways. Without peasants to farm the land, the Lord's wealth would disappear. Without the protection and land provided by the Lord, peasants would struggle to survive in a violent and uncertain world. Even so, the daily reality for peasants remained extremely difficult. They worked long hours, gave away a large part of their harvest, and had very little control over their own lives. Freedom, as modern people understand it, was almost non-existent for most rural families. Yet life in the medieval village was not entirely without moments of community and shared experience. Peasants formed strong bonds with their neighbors. They worked together during harvests, helped each other during hard times, and gathered for religious festivals and village celebrations. These small moments of connection helped people endure the hardships of the feudal system. Still, the reality remained clear. The land belonged to the Lord. The labor belonged to the peasant, and this structure shaped the entire world of medieval rural life. But while the Lord controlled the land and the peasants worked it, another powerful institution guided their beliefs, traditions, and daily routines: the church.
The church and religion in a peasant's life. For a medieval peasant, religion was not simply a personal belief. It was a central part of everyday life. The church shaped how people understood the world, explained suffering, and gave meaning to both life and death. In nearly every village there stood a small church. It might have been built of stone or simple wood, often the largest and most important building in the area. The church was more than a place of worship. It served as the heart of the community. People gathered there for prayers, celebrations, marriages, and funerals. The church marked the rhythm of life from birth to death. The village priest held an important position in society. Although he was not as powerful as a lord, he was respected as a spiritual leader. The priest conducted religious services, listened to confessions, and taught villagers about the teachings of Christianity. Most peasants could not read or write, so the priest was often the main source of religious knowledge. Through sermons and stories, he explained biblical events and moral lessons to the community. Church bells played a powerful role in daily life. Their sound could be heard across the fields and throughout the village. The bells called people to prayer, marked the passing of time, and announced important events. For peasants working in the fields, the ringing of the bells reminded them when to pause and pray. Religious belief offered comfort in a world filled with hardship. When crops failed, when disease spread, or when loved ones died, many peasants believed these events were part of God's plan. The church taught that life on earth was temporary and often filled with suffering. However, those who lived faithful and humble lives would be rewarded in heaven after death. This belief helped many peasants endure the difficult conditions they faced. Religious festivals were some of the most joyful moments in village life. These special days broke the routine of work and allowed people to gather in celebration. Major Christian holidays such as Christmas and Easter were widely observed. During these times, villagers attended church services, shared food, and sometimes held small feasts. Other festivals were connected to the agricultural calendar. Certain saints' days marked important points in the farming year, such as planting or harvest time. These events brought the entire village together. Music, storytelling, and dancing sometimes followed religious services. Although life was usually serious and focused on survival, these celebrations allowed peasants to relax and enjoy moments of happiness. The church also influenced many everyday rules and behaviors. Marriage was considered a sacred ceremony performed in the church. Couples received blessings from the priest before beginning their lives together. Funerals were another important religious event. When someone died, the community gathered at the church to pray for the person's soul. Burial usually took place in the churchyard, close to the sacred building. Many peasants believed that resting near the church helped ensure their place in heaven. The church also collected taxes known as tithes. Typically, peasants were required to give about 10% of their harvest to support the church. This could be difficult for families who were already struggling to feed themselves, but most people accepted it as a religious duty. Superstition often mixed with religion during the Middle Ages. Peasants believed in signs, omens, and unseen forces that could influence their lives. Some believed illness might be caused by evil spirits or curses. Others carried small charms or prayed to specific saints for protection against certain dangers. For example, farmers might pray to a particular saint to protect their crops from storms or disease. Even the weather was sometimes interpreted through a religious lens. A violent storm might be seen as a warning or punishment from God. Despite these fears, religion remained a powerful source of hope. In a world where peasants had little control over their circumstances, faith provided comfort and stability. It gave people a way to understand suffering and to believe that something better awaited them beyond this life. The church stood as a constant presence through all seasons. Whether the village was celebrating a successful harvest or mourning during times of famine and disease, the church remained at the center of community life. But even in this deeply religious world, peasants still had moments when work paused and life allowed for small celebrations and gatherings. These moments of rest were rare, but they were deeply valued. And in the next chapter, we will explore how medieval peasants found brief joy during festivals, markets, and village celebrations. Rare joy. Festivals, markets, and village celebrations. Life for a medieval peasant was usually defined by hard labor, strict obligations, and constant uncertainty. Most days were filled with farming, caring for animals, and maintaining the small household. However, even in this demanding world, there were moments when work paused and the village came together for celebration. These moments were rare, but they were deeply important. Festivals and gatherings offered peasants a break from the endless cycle of work. They brought laughter, music, food, and a sense of community that helped people endure the hardships of everyday life. Most celebrations were connected to religion. The church calendar included many holy days throughout the year, and these events often meant a day of rest from the fields. One of the most important celebrations was Christmas. Although the holiday looked different from modern celebrations, it still carried great meaning. Villagers gathered in the church for special services, and families prepared the best food they could manage. Even poor families tried to make the day feel special. Bread might be baked fresh, and if the family had saved meat, it could be cooked for the occasion. Another major celebration was Easter, which marked the resurrection of Christ. Like Christmas, it included church services,
prayers, and gatherings with neighbors. These religious holidays were not just spiritual events, they were also social occasions where people could talk, share stories, and spend time together. Markets were another important part of village life. Many villages held small markets where peasants could trade goods. Farmers brought vegetables, grain, eggs, and sometimes livestock. Craftsmen might sell tools, pottery, or cloth. For peasants who rarely traveled beyond their village, the market could feel exciting. It was a chance to see new faces, hear news from nearby towns, and trade items that were difficult to produce at home. Some larger towns hosted annual fairs that lasted several days. These fairs attracted merchants from distant regions who sold a wide variety of goods. At these fairs, peasants might see things they rarely encountered, such as colorful fabrics, spices from faraway lands, or finely crafted metal tools. Entertainment also appeared during these gatherings. Traveling performers sometimes visited villages and fairs. These entertainers might include musicians, storytellers, jugglers, or actors who performed simple plays. For people whose lives were usually serious and focused on survival, such performances were a welcome change. Village celebrations also included traditional games and dancing. After a long harvest season, communities sometimes held small celebrations to mark the completion of the work. These gatherings might include shared meals and simple music played on instruments like flutes or drums. Dancing in open fields or village squares was common during these moments. Although the food available at these celebrations was still simple, it often felt like a feast compared to everyday meals. Bread, cheese, vegetables, and occasionally roasted meat might be shared among families. Ale flowed more freely than usual, and laughter filled the air. For a brief time, the worries of hunger, taxes, and hard labor seemed to fade. Young people especially enjoyed these gatherings. Festivals and markets were among the few opportunities for social interaction beyond daily work. It was often during these events that young men and women met future spouses. Marriage was an important part of village life. When a wedding occurred, the entire community often joined the celebration. Weddings included food, music, and dancing that sometimes lasted late into the evening. These joyful occasions strengthened the bonds between villagers. Although life remained difficult, peasants relied on these shared moments to maintain a sense of hope and unity. But these celebrations did not last long. Soon the festivals ended, the music faded, and the villagers returned to their daily routines. The fields still needed tending, animals required care, tools needed repair, and beyond the village, powerful forces were shaping the wider world. Wars between kingdoms and lords sometimes reached the countryside, bringing new dangers to peasant communities. In the next chapter, we will explore how war affected the lives of ordinary peasants and how conflict could suddenly disrupt the fragile peace of village life.
War, soldiers, and the danger to peasant villages. Although medieval peasants spent most of their lives focused on farming and survival, the larger political world could still reach them in sudden and dangerous ways. Kings and nobles often fought wars over land, power, and wealth. While these conflicts were usually decided by armies and knights, the effects were often felt most strongly by the peasants who lived in the countryside. Peasant villages were rarely protected from the consequences of war. When armies moved through rural areas, they needed food, supplies, and shelter. Soldiers often took what they needed from nearby villages. Grain, animals, tools, and even firewood could be seized to support the army. For a peasant family, losing stored grain or livestock could be devastating. These supplies were meant to last through the winter. Without them, hunger could quickly follow.
Sometimes armies paid for what they took, but more often peasants were forced to give up their goods without compensation. The arrival of soldiers was often frightening for villagers. Armed men passing through the countryside created tension and fear. Many soldiers were not disciplined, and some behaved violently toward local populations. Villages sometimes suffered damage when armies clashed nearby. Fields could be trampled, barns burned, and homes destroyed. Even if the battle itself happened far from the village, the movement of large groups of soldiers could ruin farmland. In times of serious conflict, peasants might abandon their homes and flee temporarily. Families sometimes hid in forests or sought protection inside fortified structures belonging to the local lord. Many manors included a small castle or fortified building where peasants could gather during attacks. These strongholds offered limited protection against raiders or enemy forces. However, not every village had such defenses. Some peasants were also required to assist in wartime efforts. Lords might demand labor to repair roads, build defensive walls, or transport supplies for soldiers. Occasionally, peasants themselves were called to fight. While most medieval armies were made up of trained knights and professional soldiers, local farmers could be recruited during emergencies. These peasant fighters were rarely well equipped. They might carry simple weapons such as spears, axes, or farming tools. Fighting trained soldiers was extremely dangerous for them. Because of this, peasants often feared war even more than the nobles who started it. War could also interrupt farming. When men were forced to leave their fields to assist with military duties, crops might go unplanted or unharvested. A single season of disrupted farming could lead to food shortages for the entire village. In addition to battles and armies, raiders were another threat in some regions. Small groups of armed men sometimes attacked rural areas to steal food, animals, or valuables. These raids were especially dangerous for isolated villages far from major towns or castles. The fear of violence and theft was always present in the medieval countryside. Yet despite these dangers, peasants had little influence over the wars that affected their lives. Decisions about conflict were made by kings and nobles, far above them in the social hierarchy. For the average peasant, war was something that simply happened to them, rather than something they could control. When armies finally moved away and peace returned, villagers faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives. Damaged homes had to be repaired, burned fields had to be replanted, lost animals needed to be replaced. The resilience of peasant communities was remarkable. Even after destruction and hardship, they continued working the land and supporting their families. But war was not the only hardship that shaped peasant life. Another challenge came from the harsh environment of their homes and villages themselves. Living conditions in medieval rural communities were often uncomfortable, crowded, and unsanitary. In the next chapter, we will explore what daily life inside a peasant home was truly like, and how families lived within these small and difficult spaces.
Childhood, education, and the early responsibilities of peasant children. Life for a medieval peasant child was very different from the childhood we think of today. There were no schools for most children, no toys or games for many, and very little freedom from the demands of survival. From the moment they could walk, children were expected to help their families and contribute to daily work. Peasant children were born into a world of hard labor. Families relied on every member to ensure survival, so children learned skills early. Toddlers might begin with small tasks, carrying water from the well, gathering firewood, or feeding chickens and goats. These small chores help the child understand responsibility and the importance of contributing to the household. By the age of 6 or 7, children were performing more significant work. Boys often assisted with herding animals, tending crops, or helping with simple field tasks. Girls were taught domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, making simple clothing, and caring for younger siblings. Learning these skills early was essential for survival. Formal education was rare. Most peasant children could not read or write. Instead, knowledge was passed orally from parents, older siblings, or village elders. Stories, songs, and lessons about farming, weather, and religion shaped their understanding of the world. Religious instruction often came from the local priest, who might teach basic prayers, Bible stories, and moral lessons. Play still existed, but it was often intertwined with work. Children created simple toys from sticks, clay, or scraps of cloth. They played games that taught them coordination, teamwork, or skills useful for adult life. For example, a game chasing chickens might develop agility, while mock herding exercises prepared them for working with animals later. Health and safety were constant concerns. Children were vulnerable to disease, malnutrition, and injury. The lack of medical knowledge meant that even minor illnesses could become dangerous. Parents did their best using herbal remedies or home treatments, but there were limits to what could be done. Despite the hardships, childhood offered moments of learning, laughter, and discovery. Festivals and religious celebrations allowed children to experience joy outside work. They observed the traditions of their community and participated in small rituals, songs, and dances that created a sense of belonging. Education, in the practical sense, came from daily work. Children learned to identify edible plants, understand weather patterns, care for animals, and manage basic tools. These lessons were vital. They would determine the child's ability to survive as an adult in the harsh medieval environment. By adolescence, most peasant children were fully integrated into the labor of the household. Boys might be helping with plowing, harvesting, or repairing fences. Girls could manage cooking, water collection, and childcare alongside older women in the family. By the teenage years, childhood as we know it had mostly ended. Life for peasant children was a mixture of work, learning, and small moments of joy. They grew up quickly because the world demanded it. Every skill, every lesson, every chore contributed to their survival and the survival of the family. Childhood prepared them for the same cycle that had shaped generations before. Working the land, following the Lord's rules, enduring hardship, and seeking hope through faith and community. In the next chapter, we will explore marriage, family life, and the roles of adults in peasant society, where survival depended not just on labor, but on strong family bonds and careful planning.
Marriage, family life, and adult responsibilities. For medieval peasants, adulthood was defined by work, responsibility, and family. Life revolved around survival, and family structures were central to meeting the demands of the land, the lord, and the village. Marriage, household management, and raising children were not just personal choices, they were essential for survival. Marriage usually occurred in the late teens or early 20s. Decisions about marriage were influenced by practical considerations. Families often arranged unions to strengthen alliances, secure land, or combine resources. Love and affection could exist, but survival needs took priority. A typical wedding was modest for peasant families. It might include a small ceremony in the village church, simple decorations, and shared food with neighbors. The priest blessed the marriage, emphasizing its religious significance and the responsibilities it brought. Once married, adults faced immediate responsibilities. Husbands and wives shared the burden of labor, though roles were often divided along gender lines. Men continued to work the heaviest tasks in the fields, plowing, sowing seeds, harvesting, and maintaining tools and fences. They might also repair buildings, chop firewood, or help the Lord with required labor days.
Women managed both domestic and agricultural duties. In addition to working in the fields, women cooked, cleaned, fetched water, spun wool into thread, and cared for children. Their labor was constant, extending from before dawn to after sunset. Women also helped process food for storage, preserving grains and vegetables for winter months. Children became integral to family life as soon as they were capable of work. Mothers and fathers taught them essential skills, ensuring that by adolescence each child could contribute fully. Large families were common because more hands meant more help with work, and because child mortality was high. It was not unusual for families to lose several children to disease, malnutrition, or accidents, so having many children was both practical and necessary. Financial and material responsibilities were also pressing. Peasants had to plan carefully to feed their families year-round. Grain had to be stored for the winter, animals fed, and clothing repaired or made from scratch. Every decision, from how much seed to plant to how much food to save, could mean the difference between survival and hardship. Religion played a guiding role in adult life. Marriage was considered sacred, and the family was viewed as a fundamental social and spiritual unit. Adults attended church regularly, celebrated religious festivals, and taught children prayers and moral lessons. Religious observance provided structure, comfort, and a shared sense of purpose. Despite the endless work, adults found moments of rest and social connection. Festivals, market days, and communal gatherings allowed couples to interact with neighbors, share stories, and strengthen village bonds. These occasions offered brief relief from labor and a reminder that life contained more than work. Parenting was demanding and continuous. From infancy through adolescence, children required attention, guidance, and teaching. Parents balanced the care of young children with the labor of survival, often improvising solutions to maintain both. Families slept together in small, crowded homes, shared meals around the hearth, and supported each other through sickness, hunger, and danger. Even leisure was shaped by necessity. Music, storytelling, and simple games were woven into daily life, but always secondary to survival. Celebrations like weddings, harvest festivals, and church feasts were precious opportunities to experience joy. The life of an adult peasant was a careful balance of work, family, and faith. Every day required effort, foresight, and resilience. Adults bore the weight of survival not only for themselves, but for their children and aging parents. Yet, even in this world of constant labor, danger, and obligation, small pleasures, strong family bonds, and a sense of community helped peasants endure. Their daily lives were hard, but they were lived with determination and continuity, forming the foundation for generations to come. In the next chapter, we will explore the harsh realities of winter, shelter, and survival during the coldest months, when life became even more unforgiving.
Winter in the medieval world was one of the greatest tests for peasants. The long, cold months brought shorter days, frozen fields, scarce food, and the constant threat of illness. For families who already lived on the edge of survival, winter demanded endurance, careful planning, and resilience. As autumn ended and the first frost appeared, peasants prepared for the cold. Crops had to be harvested and stored before snow or ice could ruin them. Grain was kept in barns, often elevated to protect it from moisture and rodents. Vegetables were preserved in root cellars or buried in the ground to keep them from freezing. Firewood was another critical resource. Villages collected and stacked wood throughout the year so that homes could remain warm during harsh weather. Without sufficient firewood, families risked freezing during the long nights. Huts were poorly insulated.
Thatched roofs let in cold wind, and walls made from wattle and daub offered limited protection. Families slept huddled together on straw beds to share body heat. Sometimes animals were allowed inside the home at night for warmth, though this added to the challenge of maintaining cleanliness and reducing disease. Food scarcity became most acute in winter. Grain from the previous harvest had to last until the next planting season. Vegetables from gardens were gone, and livestock had to be fed carefully to ensure survival through the cold months. Meals were small, often consisting of thin pottage or bread soaked in weak ale. Families rationed their supplies to make them last, sometimes eating just once or twice a day when resources were extremely tight. Illness and cold worked together to increase mortality. Frostbite, pneumonia, and other ailments were common. Malnourished peasants were especially vulnerable. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening without proper care. The combination of hunger, disease, and exposure made winter a season of fear for many families. Daily life slowed in winter, but work did not stop entirely. Fields could not be plowed, but maintenance tasks, repair work, and animal care continued. Snow and ice made travel difficult, limiting access to markets, church services, or neighboring villages. Isolation increased the psychological toll of the season. Despite these challenges, winter also brought moments of relief and celebration. Religious holidays like Christmas offered a brief respite from labor. Families shared what little food they had, attended church services, and took part in communal rituals. The glow of the hearth, storytelling, and small gatherings provided comfort during the long nights. Peasants developed strategies to endure the season. They stored surplus grain, preserved food, and carefully managed livestock. Clothing was layered and patched repeatedly to retain warmth. Community support was vital. Neighbors shared firewood, helped with repairs, and assisted families in crisis. The harshness of winter reinforced the resilience and resourcefulness of peasant communities. Surviving these months required planning, cooperation, and relentless effort. Even after enduring hunger, cold, and illness, peasants looked forward to spring, when the growing season would bring renewed hope and the chance to work the land once again. Winter was a reminder of the fragility of peasant life. Survival was never guaranteed, and every family lived with the knowledge that the next frost, famine, or disease outbreak could have devastating consequences. Yet, through sheer determination and communal support, peasants endured, continuing the cycle of labor, faith, and family that defined their world. In the next chapter, we will conclude the story by examining the enduring legacy of medieval peasant life and how their struggles shaped the future.
Inside a peasant home, living conditions and family life. For medieval peasants, home was both a sanctuary and a place of constant challenge. The small huts they lived in offered shelter from the elements, but comfort was scarce, and daily life inside these simple homes could be difficult. Understanding how peasants lived indoors gives us a closer look at the reality behind their long days of labor. Most peasant homes were small, usually consisting of just 1 or 2 rooms. Walls were often made from wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, mud, and straw. Roofs were covered with thatch, which was effective for keeping out rain but offered little insulation against cold winters. In colder regions, smoke from the fire often filled the interior because many huts lacked chimneys. Inside, the furniture was minimal. A simple wooden table, a few stools, and possibly a chest for storing clothing or tools were the only furnishings. Beds were rough piles of straw, sometimes covered with blankets woven from coarse wool. Families often slept together in these beds, huddled for warmth during the harsh winter months. Hygiene was another challenge. Clean water was limited, and bathing was rare. Most villages had wells, but water could easily be contaminated. Rivers were sometimes used for washing, but their water was also often polluted. As a result, disease could easily spread within the home. Fleas, lice, and other pests were common and added to the discomfort of daily life. Cooking was done over a central hearth, which served multiple purposes. It provided warmth, a place to cook food, and light in an otherwise dim interior. Pottage, the thick vegetable and grain stew, was a daily staple. It cooked slowly over the fire, and families would often add whatever ingredients were available: roots, cabbage, onions, or the occasional piece of meat or fish. Peasant families worked together constantly. Children helped with chores from a young age, fetching water, gathering firewood, caring for animals, or assisting with food preparation. Women tended to domestic tasks as well as farm work, while men focused on the heaviest labor in the fields. Even elderly family members contributed by caring for small children or repairing tools. Despite the hardships, home life also included moments of connection and community. Families shared stories, songs, and prayers, often at the fire in the evening. Religion played a central role, and families might read or listen to passages from the Bible if someone in the household could read. For many, faith provided a sense of purpose and comfort amid the challenges of daily life. Privacy was almost non-existent. With only one room in many homes, multiple generations lived together in close quarters. There was little space for solitude, and personal possessions were few. However, this closeness fostered strong family bonds. People relied heavily on one another for survival and support. Even small celebrations or gatherings often took place within or near the home. Birthdays, religious milestones, or special meals were modest but meaningful. A freshly baked loaf of bread, an extra egg, or a visit from a traveling entertainer could bring rare joy to a family accustomed to scarcity. Winter presented its own set of challenges. Cold winds penetrated the walls, and firewood was limited. Families slept close together to conserve warmth, and every bit of leftover food was carefully rationed. Starvation could be a real threat, especially in years when the harvest had failed. Peasant homes were far from comfortable by modern standards, yet these small spaces were where life happened, where children grew up, meals were shared, work was planned, and families endured the harsh realities of the medieval world. Life inside the home reflected the wider world outside. Difficult, unpredictable, but sustained by resilience, faith, and community. In the next chapter, we will explore the experiences of peasant children and how their lives were shaped from birth through youth in a demanding world.
The legacy of medieval peasants: survival, resilience, and history. Medieval peasants lived lives defined by labor, obligation, and uncertainty. They faced harsh weather, famine, disease, and the constant demands of lords and the feudal system. Yet, despite these hardships, their endurance and resilience shaped not only their own communities, but the very foundation of European history. The daily life of peasants was grueling, but it was also essential. The food they grew, the animals they tended, and the labor they provided sustained entire kingdoms. Lords depended on peasants to produce wealth, armies relied on them for provisions, and towns benefited from the surplus that made trade possible. In many ways, the stability of medieval society rested on the backs of these ordinary people. Peasant communities developed systems of cooperation and mutual support that allowed them to survive under extreme conditions. Villagers shared labor during harvests, helped each other with repairs, and provided assistance during times of sickness or famine. Festivals, religious celebrations, and market days strengthened these bonds, creating a sense of community that was vital for endurance. The resilience of peasants was also cultural and spiritual. Religion provided comfort, moral guidance, and hope for the future. Faith helped families face death, disease, and the harsh cycles of hunger. Oral traditions, storytelling, and local customs preserved knowledge, reinforced social values, and connected generations. Children learned survival skills from a young age, ensuring that knowledge of farming, animal care, and practical crafts continued across generations. Families functioned as essential units of labor and education, teaching skills that were critical for life in a world without modern tools or institutions. Even the hardships endured by peasants, famine, plagues, war, and harsh winters, contributed to a collective understanding of resilience. Those who survived passed on strategies for managing risk, storing food, and sustaining life under difficult circumstances. Over time, this knowledge became a shared cultural legacy that influenced rural life for centuries. The story of medieval peasants also reminds us that history is not only made by kings, knights, or great battles. It is shaped by the daily work, endurance, and courage of ordinary people. Peasants may not have held titles or owned lands, but their labor, their faith, and their communities formed the backbone of medieval society. Although life for a peasant was often harsh and uncertain, their contributions were profound. They grew the food that fed kingdoms, maintained the land that sustained society, and preserved cultural and religious traditions that endured long after the Middle Ages ended. By examining their lives, we gain insight into the human capacity for endurance, adaptation, and hope. The struggles of medieval peasants remind us that survival requires not only physical strength, but also cooperation, ingenuity, and faith. Their story is one of hardship and perseverance, of a life shaped by labor, bound by obligation, yet carried forward with courage. It is a story that reflects the resilience of ordinary people and the enduring legacy they left in the history of Europe and the world. Even in the shadows of castles and churches, beyond the battles and politics of kings, the lives of peasants were full of meaning, struggle, and humanity. Their daily existence, though difficult, formed the foundation of a world that would continue to evolve long after the last medieval harvest was gathered.